All right. Some of you have been asking about how I go about getting my barley from the field to, the grain version of it. So, out in the field, I used one of these, a sickle, and went around and grabbed a bunch of barley and whacked it off and got it up in my hands and tied it together and let it dry like that. And so then when it's all dry, I gather it all up in a big pile, and I come over here, spread it out, and this is what they call flailing. Now, in the old times, they had another stick attached to this that was like nunchucks, like big nunchucks, and they would bash it with nunchucks. So, but I only have a little bit to do, so I'm just going to use a couple of these, and I can pretend like this is the nunchuck, where my wrist is like the flexible part, and I can, flail about like.
Shavuot Tov, everyone, and welcome to another Taste of Torah. Of course, the conclusion of all that is when our demonstrator turns it into beer. But we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, I could be talking about this week's Torah portion, because this week's Torah portion is the famous passage in the middle of Leviticus called Kedoshim, which lists the many things that we are called to do in order to make ourselves holy. That's rather a familiar passage for many of us. We hear it every Yom Kippur. So I'm not going to focus on that. Rather, I'm going to focus on the more indirect journey to holiness that comes from what is known as the Sifrat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer. Now, you may ask yourself, what is an Omer and why are we counting it? Well, an Omer is what you just saw. It's a sheaf of barley, or a sheaf, it could be anything, but it's a sheaf of barley in this case, because what's happening in the land of Israel in ancient times, sorry, I'm getting a bit of a hiccup, is this. As soon as we get through the holiday of Passover, and actually in rabbinic tradition, we count from the second day of Passover, the second Seder, as we do in our community Seder, and you count 7 weeks, 7 times 7, 49 days, and when you get to the end of those 49 days, it's time for our next holiday, Shavuot, which marks the theoretical end of the barley harvest and the beginning of the wheat harvest. So in ancient times, there were twofold harvests in the land of Israel, and you would be doing the barley, and then you would be doing the wheat. And Pesach and Shavuot each fall approximately at the beginning of each one of those harvest times. So, in fact, the holiday of Shavuot is directly rooted in the land of Israel. And I use the word rooted advisedly, as I will use a number of other words that have developed into more significant terms, but we use them, their basis is agricultural. In any case, so that's the beginning. However, there is also a spiritual dimension attached to Shavuot, which, if you're not familiar with it, which I think you are, I'll mention it anyway. It's the giving of the Torah. Zaman Matan HaTorah, the time of the giving of the Torah. According to rabbinic tradition, this is when we have arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God is going to give us the 10 commandments and the other 603 commandments in the form of the entire Torah. There's some debate in rabbinic tradition about whether we received the entire Torah at Mount Sinai or whether the entire Torah was revealed over the course of the 40 years of traveling through the wilderness. It makes more sense that it took 40 years because the later books of the Torah account for things that haven't happened yet, or will have happened once we get to the end of the 40 years. Let's not get caught up in those mind tricks. Any case, I want to start talking about the agricultural aspects and then show us how it shifted into a spiritual aspect. So it's just as was shown. Our ancestors would go to our barley harvest, the first harvest, really in some ways the most important harvest, even though barley isn't a great product for general cereal. Some of you may eat barley. I don't. I'm definitely a wheat guy. More importantly, I have, because I love ancient technology and understanding it, I have made barley cakes according to basically the biblical recipe. I've ground them, shaped them, mixed them with olive oil, baked them, and oh my God, it's really, really the food of desperation. If the matzah is the food of affliction, the barley cake is the food of desperation. Really pretty tasteless, tough, not a pleasant experience per se. So, and indeed, if the harvest from the previous year had not been great and you don't have a lot of leftover stores, you would probably eat barley cakes to carry you through to the end until you got to the wheat harvest. However, I think probably our ancestors did something else, which I alluded to earlier. There is a word in the Hebrew Bible, shikar, which refers to some kind of liquor, and I'm sure it's beer. They just took much of the kilocalories, the nutritional value of barley, and turned it into a thick malt drink with barley and drank that with a little alcohol mixed in instead of these dreadful barley cakes. But it all depends on, again, how the season had gone the year before. So our ancestors would gather up a sheaf in their hand, just like you saw, but at least for the first 800 years of Israelite history, they wouldn't have had a metal sickle. Its metal was just too precious. When we say the Bronze Age, we're talking about the peak of technology. So most farmers didn't own the peak of technology. They didn't own bronze or iron instruments. So instead, what they would have either had was a stone that had been flaked to make it sharp and cut it with that, a kind of lithographic knife or lithic knife, or they would have had the same thing but embedded it in a curved wood or jawbone of an animal and given them a larger sweep, and they would have cut with those things. Now, remember that flint, chert, or obsidian that has been chipped is extremely sharp, so it's a good tool. And it's a cheap tool compared to that sort of thing. So anyway, they would cut it, and they would have all of this, and they would lay it out, make sure it was all completely dry, and then, as he said, they would flail it or winnow it. Now, again, have to imagine ancient Israel. It may well have been a little more verdant than it is now, but having a bunch of flexible sticks might have been a little hard to come by. Maybe if you lived by the Jordan River, you would have gotten willow branches or something like that, and you would have beaten. But what if you live in highlands far away from that? You could trade for those things, or you could do something else, which I have seen in a number of examples, and that's called a winnowing sledge. And what you would do is you would get a single wooden plank, and you would insert more sharpened rocks in it, and then you would, with a rope, drag it across your pile of barley. Now, you have to imagine it's a fairly big pile of barley, and that would help separate the seeds, the edible seeds, from the stalks. One could even imagine an ancient Israelite standing on the sledge while other people pulled it in a kind of, prehistoric surfing in order to get the full effect of the device. In any case, they would do this. Now, what does this have to do with our holidays and with our sacred tradition? It's just food. Well, food is, as we like to say in English, the staff of life, right? And what would happen was that our ancestors used to honor the tradition that the fullness of the earth is God's glory, and that means the living things, they would understand that all of these products belong to God, but that we could utilize them if we acknowledged that. So each day of the 49 days, a single sheaf of barley would be brought to either the sacred high place for worshiping the God of Israel or later in the temple, and that would be offered as an offering. And so each of the 49, 50 days, there would be an offering of a sheaf, an Omer of barley. And so this was a counting that led us up to Shavuot, a holiday that, unlike other Jewish holidays, is not attached to the cycles of the moon, but is directly attached to the earth in the form of the agricultural process. So that was the tradition. Now, how does it become spiritualized? What do we do with it now that you and I are no longer barley farmers? That we no longer live this kind of agricultural life? As interesting as that is as an antiquarian idea, what does that mean to us today? Well, I would like you to just sort of do a psychological imagination of this process and see how it becomes spiritualized. So there you are, the first objects that assure your life in the coming year are being harvested. You take them in your hand, you slice them off, they are disconnected from the earth, but they become yours. And in time, what you're going to do is you're going to gather up all of these sheaves and you're going to carry them to wherever you're going to process them. So it's like you're giving them the hug of life. These things are life itself. And then you process it, and then you make some beer out of it, and you're very happy. So as time goes on, and this agricultural process, which is specific to the land of Israel, becomes less and less relevant to our ancestors. Even if they are still farmers, they're not following the agricultural patterns of the land of Israel, wherever they are, whether it be France or Turkey or Iraq or Poland. They're living a different rhythm. So instead, what we do is we come to recognize this idea of the embracing of life and the embracing of hope. And so it becomes a kind of spiritual embrace as we prepare ourselves to get to Mount Sinai. Instead of counting the life-giving objects in our hand, what we start counting are the value-giving things that give us hope for the future. And so counting the Omer became, under the rabbis, a regime or tradition of improving oneself. So each day of the Omer, you could focus on a different midah, a different personal quality that you want to cultivate, get it, so that you can grow, get it, as a person and flourish, get it? And so in counting the Omer, the rabbis would encourage us to contemplate cultivating humility, honesty, charity, compassion, courage, etc., etc. 49 midot, 49 qualities that we take in our hand and we draw to ourselves. And at the culmination of it, we find ourselves at the foot of Mount Sinai, where God is going to give us a gift. But in order to be able to receive that gift, we have to bring God gifts. Our ancestors literally believed that they would bring the staff of life to God as a sign of their gift, acknowledgement of God's gift, and then they would be able to participate in it. But we translate that idea into cultivating ourselves. We become an armful of Omerim, a embodiment of this life-giving process through cultivating a better self. And when we get to Mount Sinai, we offer God the gift of all of these qualities that we have cultivated in ourselves in order to deserve God's love. And in exchange, God takes these gifts from our arms and gives us a gift of his own or her own. All right. And suddenly, all these human qualities come back to us as a divine revelation. And we become part of this sacred exchange that is going on between the human and the divine. And in here, of course, to complete the circle, we learn all about the tradition of counting the Omer. And so that's what we do during this period. And let me take a moment to share this with you. So there is a bracha for anything that God tells us to do. And what we are commanded to do is count the Omer. So we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sifrat haomer. Praised are you, Adonai our God, ruler of time and space, who sanctifies us through commandments and commands us to count the sheaves, to count the Omer. And then on this particular day, we would then add this one addendum to the prayer. Hayom Yom Asorah HaOmer. Today is the 10th day of counting the Omer, as it is the 10th day. And so I hope you might take this time to develop yourself a little bit, so that when we get to that time of Shavuot, when the time of collecting our reward for the giving of our gifts comes, that we will be ready to open our arms to this loving gift, the Omer, the not the Omer, forgive me, the Torah, which is not the staff of life, but as we like to call it, the tree of life. Shalom Haverim. I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk next week.